In 2022, something remarkable happened. The BRICS alliance, a group once dismissed as a loose collection of developing economies, officially surpassed the G7 in global GDP when measured by purchasing power. And with new members like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Egypt recently joining the bloc, it's becoming harder to ignore a simple question. Is BRICS actually becoming a serious threat to US global dominance? For decades, the US has ruled the global order through the dollar, its military alliances, and its leadership of institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. But cracks are beginning to show. America's reliance on sanctions, tariffs, and financial pressure, classic hard power moves, is starting to push even its traditional allies away. Meanwhile, China, the heart of the BRICS alliance, is playing a very different game. Through projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, it's building infrastructure, offering loans, and winning influence across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, all under the illusion of soft power and mutual development. So as BRICS grows and America leans harder on coercion, the real question is, are we watching the beginning of a new world order? And if so, what does that mean for the future of US power? When BRICS was first coined in the early 2000s, it sounded more like an economic buzzword than a geopolitical threat. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and later South Africa were seen as promising emerging markets, but far from a unified bloc. Well, fast forward to today and things have changed dramatically. In 2024, BRICS not only expanded its membership, inviting Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the UAE, but also quietly overtook the G7 in terms of global GDP using purchasing power parity. That's huge and symbolic because for the first time, a coalition of mostly non-Western countries is rivaling the traditional powers on paper and possibly now in influence. But it's not just about GDP. These nations are now talking about creating their own financial systems, from a shared currency to independent payment networks, all designed to reduce reliance on the US dollar and Western institutions. And perhaps the most important thing, they're not just talking anymore, they're starting to act. So what exactly is pushing this alliance forward, and is America inadvertently helping their cause? Well, first, we need to understand America's role in the global economy. For most of the post-World War II era, the United States didn't just participate in the global system, it built it. And now for decades, the United States has been the architect and enforcer of the global order. The dollar's dominance as the world's reserve currency, coupled with leadership in institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, have cemented America's influence worldwide. And when diplomacy fails, well, American military presence fills in the gaps. However, recent years have revealed cracks in this leadership, particularly through America's increasing reliance on hard power tactics, economic sanctions, tariffs, and financial pressures to achieve its foreign policy objectives.
Tomorrow, tariffs 25% on Canada and 25% on Mexico, and that'll start.
We're implementing comprehensive sanctions on Russian sovereign debt. That means we've cut off Russia's government from Western financing.
Any country that purchases oil and gas from Venezuela will be forced to pay a tariff of 25% to the United States.
Today, the United Nations Security Council voted overwhelmingly to sanction Iran for its continued failure to live up to its obligations.
On paper, these are powerful tools, but overuse has a cost. Take economic sanctions, for example. With most of global trade being processed in US dollars through American financial institutions, this gives America an enormous amount of power to lock out countries from this global payment system. America did this very effectively with Iran, for example, to pressure them to sign a nuclear non-proliferation agreement in 2015. In 2012, the US imposed sanctions on Iran, blocking American banks and institutions from processing any dollar-denominated transactions involving their country. And once Iran signed the deal in 2015, the sanctions were lifted. But have a look at how that affected Iran's ability to sell oil. As you can see, 2012 exports dropped dramatically as the sanctions took effect. And then in 2015, their oil exports rose from 1 million barrels per day to over 2.5 million barrels per day by 2017. That's the power of controlling the world's reserve currency. And what happened next, I hear you ask? Well, guess what? In 2018, Trump reinstated sanctions once again, which is why their exports fell to 330,000 barrels per day in late 2019. But here's the interesting thing about this chart. Iran's oil exports are now rising again despite sanctions still being in place. Why? China. China doesn't care. They're buying up Iranian oil super cheap all thanks to America. Iran's oil trade is now increasingly conducted in non-dollar currencies like yuan or rupees. This is a really interesting consequence of America increasingly using its hard power tactics. Have a look at this chart, which shows the active US sanctions over time. Back in the 50s, there was less than 10 active US sanctions, but today, America uses that power more and more to get what they want. But because America leans on hard power tactics more and more, countries get fed up and then they start looking to alternatives. This has led the BRICS nations to band together and start working on their own international payment system that, if implemented, will cut out the need for the SWIFT network. And with it, cuts out the ability for America to impose hefty financial sanctions on these countries. America flexed their muscles so hard that it actually motivated other countries to find another way around. That's important to understand for the next part of the video, but one other thing you might be motivated to find a way around is spam messages. I feel like today spam is a bigger problem than it's ever been. You know, I get inundated with spam emails and messages on a daily basis, and the reason for it is because for bad players, harvesting and selling on your data is easier than you expect. Data brokers know your name, know your phone number, know where you live, and then they sell this information to the highest bidder. And it happens much more frequently than you might expect. For example, I was reading an NPR article the other week talking about how health insurers scrape your data and then use it to jack up the cost of your insurance. That's crazy. But that's where today's video sponsor comes in, Incogni, because what they do is they reach out to data brokers on your behalf and they get you taken off of these lists. So how it works is you sign up, you give Incogni permission to act on your behalf, and then they go out and find what lists you're on and they demand you be taken off. And they make sure your data stays off the market by conducting repeated removals. As I've said in the past, I'm personally on the yearly subscription, and if you'd be interested in trying this service out for yourself and getting your data out of data brokers' hands, you can sign up using the link in the description and pinned comment, and by using the referral code NEWMONEY, you can score 60% off an annual plan. So before the break, we looked at how America's increasing use of financial sanctions has driven BRICS nations, many of which are labeled as adversaries, to band together in an effort to cut the US out of their trade systems. But here's where it gets really interesting. A lot of people believe that the same kind of shift could also happen with America's allies, especially if the US keeps using tariffs as a political weapon, something that has become a core part of Donald Trump's trade strategy. Trump's approach doesn't just target rivals like China, it also impacts close partners like Canada, Mexico, Japan, and the European Union. Under his trade policy, even allies found themselves hit with sweeping tariffs. This is another example of the US using hard power tactics, applying economic pressure to try and force outcomes that benefit America. Take the tariffs on Canada and Mexico. One of the motivations there wasn't trade related at all, it was immigration. The US wanted to pressure both countries into tightening their borders to reduce the flow of illegal migrants heading to America. And while tariffs might have created short-term leverage, they come with a big cost. Here's the issue. When you slap a tariff on Canadian oil, Mexican-built cars, or Japanese machinery, you raise the price of those goods in the US market. That means fewer American companies and consumers buy them. So exports to the US fall, and naturally, those countries start looking for new buyers elsewhere. Let me give you a real-world example. My home country, Australia. Australia and the US are pretty close allies, right? But that didn't stop the Trump administration from imposing a 25% tariff on steel and aluminium imports, and yes, that included us. Now, around 20% of Australia's iron and steel exports and 13% of our aluminium exports head straight to the US. Now, if you're an American importer, you suddenly have to pay 25% more for Aussie steel or aluminium. So you're going to start looking for a cheaper supplier or buy less altogether. And that's bad news for Australian exporters, but here's the interesting part. According to researchers at the University of Sydney, if tariffs were imposed, these exports could be redirected to other markets with relative ease. In other words, we'll still make the steel, we'll just sell it somewhere else. Probably at a small discount, sure, but it's still going to move. Likely destinations? Bangladesh, Indonesia, Vietnam, or maybe India, a BRICS nation. As for our aluminium, it'll mostly go to South Korea and Japan. And that's where things start to snowball. Japan, another US ally, has also been dealing with its own trade issues with America. So if enough countries start redirecting trade, you start to see entire supply chains evolve around the US instead of through it, and that's a big deal. Tariffs in theory are a show of strength. They're America saying, we've got 330 million relatively wealthy people living here, and we're cutting off your access to them unless you play by our rules. But here's the thing, countries are still going to make what they make, and if they can't sell to America, they'll build new relationships, new distribution channels, and new dependencies, often with countries outside the US orbit. And that's where the shift gets geopolitical. When the US imposed heavy sanctions on Russia, for example, it didn't stop Russia from drilling oil. It just meant Russia started selling it to China at a steep discount. And it deepens the economic ties between two countries the US is trying to isolate. So yes, hard power tactics like tariffs and sanctions might give America a short-term advantage, but over time they can backfire because they push countries to rewire their trade, forge new partnerships, and reduce their reliance on the US altogether. And in a world where blocks like BRICS are growing in size and coordination, that's not a strategy without consequences. And this strategy is in stark contrast to the tactics being employed by the beating heart of BRICS, that being China. While the US is increasingly using hard power tactics to maintain their influence, China adopts a different strategy altogether. They are hell-bent on building influence through mutually beneficial projects. For example, with China's Belt and Road initiatives, they commonly offer a helping hand to other countries to improve infrastructure, which has grown their global influence dramatically. In Pakistan, China has poured over $60 billion into the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, building highways, power plants, and even the deep-sea Gwadar port. In Kenya, China financed 90% of the Nairobi to Mombasa Railway, a $3.2 billion project that's become a cornerstone of East African trade. In Laos, China built a $6 billion high-speed railway connecting it to Yunnan province, slashing travel times and boosting cross-border commerce. Landlocked Ethiopia now relies on a Chinese-built electric railway linking its capital to the port of Djibouti, while Serbia and Hungary are part of China's plan to transport goods through Europe via the Belgrade to Budapest railway. In the Maldives, China funded the $200 million Friendship Bridge, the country's first cross-sea connection. Meanwhile, Sri Lanka saw major Chinese investment in both the Hambantota port and Port City Colombo, though one came at a cost of a 99-year lease after Sri Lanka struggled to repay its loans. Even in resource-rich countries like the Congo, China has built roads, hospitals, power infrastructure in exchange for access to critical minerals like copper and cobalt. You get the idea. Instead of China enforcing punishment, they are offering a helping hand. Together, these projects show how China is using the illusion of soft power, building what the West won't, to win long-term influence across the global South. And even though these tactics are really hard power in disguise, with critics labeling the initiatives as debt-trap diplomacy, others, especially leaders in the global South, see it as valuable investment where Western nations haven't stepped up. Overall, China looks to lock in more deals while the US is pushing more of their trade partners away. So where does all this lead? Well, let's be clear. The US, and particularly the US dollar, isn't about to lose its relevance overnight. The US dollar isn't losing its reserve status or anything like that. In fact, as of August last year, nearly half of all global transactions were still conducted in USD. The euro remains a distant second, and the Chinese yuan, while growing, still plays a relatively small role. But this conversation is bigger than the dollar. It's about trust, it's about trade, it's about how countries respond when their access to the world's largest economy can be cut off with the stroke of a pen. America's allies might not be defecting, but they're obviously all watching. And if the US continues to lean on tariffs and economic sanctions and hardline tactics, more nations, even friends, will look for ways to reduce their dependence. So the real question isn't, is the US losing power? It's, can the US maintain its leadership without driving others away? Because in a world that's quietly realigning, that might be the difference between staying at the center or slowly being worked around. So with that said, that's all I got for this video. I hope you really enjoyed it. Let me know what you think down in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like as well. If you're interested in starting investing, please check out New Money Education as well. That is linked down in the description below. That is the best way to financially support our work here on YouTube. But with that said, guys, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Where Serbia, damn it, Djibouti.